Thank you all for being here and continuing on with our day. I don't know about you, Ken, but I've been pretty fascinated by what I've heard today. So as was shared, I spent 20 years as a public school educator, so yay, go public schools. That time was spent primarily in the classroom. I was a English language arts educator, eventually moved into the library. But really, how I kind of got to the place that that audiobooks kind of became my focus, my area of interest, and my passion was really just working with kids and trying to figure out, like I think what we've been discussing all day is like trying to figure out what works in regard to learning, teaching and learning. And as a classroom teacher, and again, we've been talking about schools and the way schools function. I'm kind of moving it into the classroom. And for me, one of the things that I learned early on in regard to learning was really letting kids, again, have that voice and choice of what worked for them. And when we're talking about books, we're all gathered here. I would assume everybody that's come today is a book person. That's why you've spent, you've taken your time on a day that could be a day doing anything else to come and really have some thoughtful conversation. So in my classroom, one of the things that one of the things that I did with my students daily was that I gave them free voluntary time to read, and it was really important to me that they could choose widely anything that they wanted to read. I had a vibrant classroom library, but I always had kids who still chose not to engage with print, and that was a constant battle for me, trying to figure out, like, if I'll let my students read just anything, why is it, if they want to read a car magazine or as I jokingly say, Playboy, because that's got articles, not Hustler, that just has pictures. I was pretty liberal in regard to what they could do, but I did have kids that they just didn't want to engage. And eventually I had an aha moment. It had to do with a brother of mine who was a non-reader, and in my family books were important. And my brother was home from a work trip and started talking to me about books for the first time. And in this conversation, I realized that for him, he had become a reader kind of accidentally. And the way he'd become a reader was engaging in audiobooks. He was a long-haul truck driver, and so he started listening to books. And I had that moment where I realized this was a game changer, that what he was doing as an adult, really I could take that same idea and implement that as a choice for my students. And so I did, and it was life-changing for me as an educator. And it changed the environment of my classroom. I saw a real difference. So from there, that's what grew for me, kind of sparked my interest in audiobooks and then the research. There's a lot of stuff in the back. I hope you'll stop and grab those things that really speak to how audiobooks serve as tools of literacy. We know that students build vocabulary listening to audiobooks. We know, they have exposure to a far larger variety of texts, build scaffolding in ways especially for readers who might struggle. It levels the playing field, and basically. And there's been a lot of research that's already been done, so I'm not going to quote it all to you. But if you want to go and investigate what it looks like, reading and audiobooks have been studied, in regards to comprehension and many other things. I think for me, what I've learned over the 20 plus years of doing this is that really audiobooks work for all kinds of learners. And that's really, we're talking, a lot of today has been about really reaching out to the learner and going to where they are and making that connection rather than a one size fits all kind of formulaic way of approaching instruction. And I think that really goes very well, very seamlessly with the way books are delivered. So, I've and I know this is a mantra that I'm not the only one that likes to share it, but I think really recognizing that books can be, we can choose to listen to books with our eyes, or we can choose to listen to them with our ears, and they're equally important ways of experiencing story. And at the end of the day, I think that's really what's important and what's essential, is making that human connection. And audiobooks really do that so beautifully. So in that, I would like to talk about story and talk about your story, and let's shift the conversation a little bit to history.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here. I must say, first of all, I really like the sound of Sir Ken. I'm gonna have to work on that.
He's trying to work this hard.
Yeah, maybe we should bring that concept here, Sir Ken. We're also obviously working on the old and young theme that seems to be developed this afternoon. But thank you all for coming, and thank you all for what you do. I am not a teacher per se. I am certainly not an academic. I've never used the word pedagogy in a sentence until just now.
You did it beautifully.
I probably didn't even say it right. But I have been throughout my career, I think, a storyteller. And when I started thinking about what to say today, these words just sort of popped into my head. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, a destroying wrath which brought upon the Acadians myriad woes and sent forth to Hades many valiant souls. So the first word in Western literature is sing. Then we get, hear, O Israel. We listen. We learn by listening. We hear. Walt Whitman understood this. I hear America singing. Longfellow understood this. Listen, my children, and you shall hear. So we learn by listening. We don't give our children, when they are newborns, a book in their crib. We sing to them. We sing the alphabet. We sing Mary Had a Little Lamb. We learn by listening. And so that's been so important to me, I think, as a writer, thinking about when I'm writing for people to hear. The Don't Know Much About series, as if you're familiar with it, is a series of questions and answers. I ask questions which can be as basic as what does the Declaration of Independence declare, or something more offbeat and quirky, like why is there a statue of Benedict Arnold's boot? So asking questions, hearing those questions, is one way to engage the reader and the listener. The other most important thing, I think, to me as a writer, and I didn't know that we would be in the Louis L'Amour room and he would appropriately have something so perfect on the wall. I think of myself in that oral tradition as a troubadour, as a village tale teller. I just read to you the first lines of the Iliad. This is, where Western literature begins. These are not things that people wrote down for people to read in books. They were stories that were meant to be told around campfires or seated together. So we come from a Western tradition of literature that is a tradition of listening. I'm very pleased that throughout my writing career, writing books, that I have partnered with Random House, now Penguin Random House, to do these wonderful audiobooks of my books. And I have had many people over the years, especially parents, talk to me and say, oh, we listened to your book when we were on a car trip. When you write a book called Don't Know Much About Geography and people take a car trip, it's a great way to travel along the road and ask questions about geography, and they get answered. So that's been a wonderful experience to me. When you go to Gettysburg, it's really nice to be able to have a disc in that is called Don't Know Much About the Civil War, and explains what Robert E. Lee was doing in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. So listening and hearing and asking questions and the exchange are very important. And what's most important to me, as a historian, we often don't think about history too often, unfortunately, in terms of dates and battles and speeches and the court decisions. And that's what makes people groan when they hear the word history. It's so dull, it's so boring. History is stories. It's stories of real people. And that's why I wrote my most recent book, In the Shadow of Liberty, is essentially the stories of 5 people, stories that got left out of the history books. The stories of 5 people who were the property of 4 of our greatest presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Jackson. And to hear those stories as they are performed on the wonderful audio version is to have these people come to life. And that's what history must be, and that's what learning must be. We must bring these stories to life. So when I talk about the story of William Lee, who was with George Washington every single day of the Revolution but wasn't in my history books. We want to hear those stories. When we hear the story of Ona Judge, this 22-year-old woman who challenged the most powerful man in America, George Washington, when she walked out of his house. And why did she do it? She did it because she learned she was going to be given away as a wedding gift. When you tell kids those stories, I assure you they will sit up and pay attention. This is not about what George Washington did in 1776 and what Thomas Jefferson wrote down on a piece of paper. This is about human beings. And when we make education that engaging, we've heard a lot, I think, today about what's wrong, and we all know a lot about what's wrong, and I'm sure you all have horror stories. So what works? I think that engaging people with stories and listening and hearing them told through audiobooks is one of the most perfect ways. And we all know that kids learn in different ways, and some are listeners. I am a student right now. I'm very proud to say, just gone back to college. I'm taking an Italian course, and in fact, buongiorno, professoressa. My professor is here, and I'm very pleased by that. But it's a very important idea, I think, to remember as educators that we're also learning. And we're learning all the time. And being a student right now, I'm amazed at how important the idea of refreshing my batteries as a learner is. So that's a small side piece to what we're talking about here. But education does not stop once we send those kids out the door, not for them and not for us. And this approach to learning is a wonderful way for all of us to continue being lifelong learners. So please.
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Hope Nation. And Hope Nation is really, I think of it as real stories, real hope. It's 24 authors, young adult authors. For those of you that may be, I would assume some of you as high school educators are familiar with YA literature. These are some of the folks that kids love really, really passionately today. And these are their stories. Kind of the background to this is simply I recognize in the teens of my own life, the teens that I've worked with, the teens that I currently work with in doing my work for the book festival, and even my own personal family. The political climate has been a hard time for many kids. And I realized all of us, whether we're old and young, we need some hope to continue to guide us. And that was really kind of the inspiration to put this book together. But I wanted to mention that because I think this goes back to what you were saying. The beauty of the audio is that it really sets up an opportunity, I think, for authentic and diverse voices to share the story. And so I thought we might talk a little bit about that. And you can go back to talking about the recordings and the Shadow of Liberty and how you feel like that piece is really why this format to deliver the story works so beautifully.
Right. Well, one of the things that we did with this book, which is written in the chapters, it's the stories are primarily told as much as possible through primary documents from these people. I mentioned two of them, William Lee, Ona Judge. There's also Isaac Granger Jefferson. Actually, that's his picture on the cover of the book. And that's just an important point to remember. We have a photograph of a man who was the property of Thomas Jefferson. We have photographs of a man who was the property of Andrew Jackson and a man who was the property of James Madison. This is not ancient history. This is pretty fresh in our history. And when you see the face of a person who was the property of the third president, it brings home, I think, especially to kids, that these are real people and they lived pretty close to our own lifetime. One of the men in the story, whose name is Alfred Jackson, the last of the stories, actually lived until the 20th century. He lived until 1904. He's buried next to Andrew Jackson in his graveyard at the Hermitage. So this is, again, makes it very, very human, very real. But one of the brilliant aspects of the production of the audio for that was that each of the stories was read by a different performer. And I have to say, as a fan of The Wire, they got some of the guys from The Wire to read some of these stories, and so that was pretty cool. I got to go to the studio, and Frankie Faison was there, and that was a pretty awesome moment. So it's very important, I think, to make sure that when we're talking about history, that these are real people. And so to hear these 5 different voices tell these 5 very different stories. Isaac Granger Jefferson, by the way, was in Yorktown, Virginia when he was 5 years old, while George Washington was bombarding the town. That was not a story in my school books. He told that later on in his life. We have this firsthand from him. So when you have the story of somebody who's in Yorktown while Washington is bombarding the British, and then says General Washington took all of us back to Monticello, and Master Jefferson was mighty happy to see his people, those voices make this story very much more real than in 1787, this one did that. And that. So that's why I think these audios are so important as learning tools. But I have a question for you, because I've heard it said to me, which is that audiobooks is kind of cheating. How do you answer that? How do you see that?
When I first started, like I mentioned how I came about becoming an advocate for audio, and that was a conversation that happened often. And I feel like there has been a shift. I think people are finally recognizing that no, it's not. And so what I see often now is I see parents, I see educators often finally getting it and embracing that students there's just as much benefit to them listening to material, to a book, as reading the print. And there are some common traits to those 2 experiences. But really, I think there's been a lot written about that actually too. Even in recent years, there was a Washington Post article, the New Yorker did a piece. It's been, as audiobooks continue to gain in popularity, and I think I could ask our audio friends in the audience, I feel like I'm right with this. It's one of the areas of publishing that's hands down the fastest growing. It's just conquering the market, and we know a lot of it has to do with the technology. This is not an audio device. Well, I guess it is kind of. You're hearing me on it, but like when I started teaching, we had cassettes and we had big players, and so we had to sit the kids down, kind of strap them down with all this stuff. And then as technology has continued to evolve, that's become more seamless. It's become smaller. Kids can choose. Again, it's really become something in their hand, and so as classroom teachers recognize the value of allowing students to choose that experience of delivering a story as opposed to print, I think we'll see that more and more. The hiccup I see often is, like with many things, it's parents who for whatever reason, maybe because of when their education happened. It's kind of like, adults seeing they have a sense of what librarians look like. And let me tell you, librarians are progressive, awesome people. But those of you that are in New York, you know that. I'm from Texas, so it's a little different. The librarians are just as awesome, but people still see a lot of those old stereotypes. But I think that, again, we could spend a lot of time talking about that whole idea of cheating. At the end of the day, in one of those pieces, and I apologize, I don't remember if it was a body of research, I know that, but the researcher talked about, he likens the experience of listening to a book versus reading a book to people going to Disneyland. And it's like if you meet a friend at Disneyland and you say, well, how did you get there? And you say, well, I rented a Lamborghini and I drove myself to Disneyland and here I am. And your friend says, well, I took the bus. At the end of the day, does it really matter how you get there? What really matters, if we're talking about instruction, but not really instruction, we're talking about learning, and experience, what really matters is getting the story, right? Having that shared experience. That's really what we all want as educators. We want our students to open their minds. We want them to be able to engage in conversation. That's the piece that I really quickly saw, where I had those kids, and again, the example I gave you in my classroom was in kind of a silent sustained, a private choice reading time. But what I recognized when students also chose to listen to a book, especially students, in some cases students that struggled and chose not to engage in text, And all that being said, audiobooks work beautifully also for really gifted readers and everyone in between. I mean, you don't have to be a poor reader, you don't have to be a gifted reader. It's all of the, everyone across that spectrum. What I saw though is when I leveled that playing field and I said, how do you want to read the story? So as a librarian, I had both print and an audio edition, and I would let the kids choose. What I saw was whether it was in classroom, whether it was in like a book club, the conversations, the kind of dialogue and discussion that happened, and the thinking. I think that's really the critical piece. The thinking that went on. It didn't really matter how that person experienced a story. They got to the same place, and they could have just as meaningful conversation. And I think that's really key. I mean, we're all educated people in this room. We're learners, right? And so, sometimes I choose to read a book with my eyes, and sometimes because of my very busy life, I have a 3.5-hour commute to work. You better believe I binge on audio. That's each way, by the way. I had 7 hours total. At Texas, everything's bigger in Texas. I work far away from my university. It just goes on forever. But I mean, I can't imagine not getting, and I'm an avid reader, so getting to have both. I mean, I feel like I'm getting ice cream and cake.
I'm going to pick up, not on the ice cream and cake, but on the conversation part. One of the things that I had always written for adults that don't know much about history and don't know much about the series.
Kids are so much better.
Well, they were written for adults, and one of the great pleasures, they were actually written for adults who had come through the school system and hadn't learned things because they were either bored or they didn't pay attention or they were lies in the first place. So that's part of what I had set out to do in the series. And what I discovered as time went by, I didn't remotely think about teachers using these books in the classroom, but as time went by, I heard more and more teachers saying, "Oh yeah, I use your books because they're more interesting to my kids," and that was very gratifying to me. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to do a series of Skypes into classrooms because I was talking about the Civil War. It was the anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And so many teachers had come to me and said, "Oh, we'd love to have you come." And so I had this with the beauty of the technology, been able to visit something like 200 classrooms over the past few years and engage with students, and I just found it a really invigorating experience. So I decided to write this book, In the Shadow of Liberty, for middle grade readers. But I have to say, very, very honestly, apart from it's shorter and it's maybe not as dense and sometimes it's not really written in a different style. And I always felt in my heart that I hoped that parents and kids would read this book together. And one of the wonderful things I've heard anecdotally since the book was published and the audio was produced is that parents and kids were listening to it together, and they were having this conversation around the dinner table about these people who certainly the parents didn't know about either, and now the kids were learning. So there was this shared learning experience, and I think that's the most, we're talking about effective learning, that's the most powerful learning experience. I know that they talk about how in many Asian countries the mothers buy all the textbooks that the kids have, and so, but this is slightly different. It's a way to share learning together, and I think that if we can do more of that as a practical solution at home, because you all know as educators that you can do so much in your classrooms, but it really depends so much about what's going on when your kids go home, and are your parents participating, and are they interested, and are they cultivating that sense of curiosity that I've always tried to express through books that ask questions. And I think that, so asking questions, telling stories, and then having a conversation. One of the things I did in The Shadow of Liberty is I didn't say that, here's these stories of these people who were owned by these men. Aren't they terrible hypocrites? I sort of said, this is what happened. What do you think? This is a different way to look at these people who we do have marble statues of them, and they are on the money. How do we see these people? And I think it's very important as a part of the learning process, whether you're reading it or hearing it, is to not make those judgments to tell everybody what the right answer is, but to give them the information that leads them to the right answer. So I think that's certainly, without studying education, that's what I've always tried to do as a writer who's interested in teaching and learning and the conversation about subjects that we all really should understand and know about.
One of the other things I wanted to share with y'all, in regards, since my assumption is many of you are classroom educators, so you're there in the trenches, is that it goes back to family and the amount of control you have, and that is obviously very, very true. But I do know that, as I was saying earlier, one of the hiccups we see is that sometimes it's parents that get in the way of being okay with the idea of listening to audio, because again, we only know what we know, and so until you educate or and make people have an awareness, I think as classroom teachers, you have a really wonderful opportunity to not just in regard to your own instruction and what you're doing in the classroom, but also to have those conversations with your parents, to highlight if you're talking about books, whether it's for a specific discipline. It might be history, it might be language arts, science. That you have those conversations, that you share very openly. That that not only are you okay with it, that you encourage families to experience stories together, that it's okay for their student, their child, to go out, go to the public library, go buy the audiobook, and let kids be open to engaging with text that way too. So a lot of that I do feel like comes from y'all directly. And the other thing I wanted to make sure I talked about a little bit, just to reference some of the strategies and so forth and ideas that you can use. There are a great number of tools that are out there. One of the things that was mentioned in the introduction was that I helped with some of the content for something called Sound Learning. And Sound Learning is a piece that's put together by the Audiobook Publishers Association, all the publishers, so it's not just Penguin Random House. Everybody had a hand in this. And you can go there as a teacher. There are a number of tools. There are classroom lessons. So if you think, okay, I get this, I think that's great, now what do I do with it, right? That's always the hardest thing. Y'all are the busiest people that there are. I mean, I know that. I did your job for a very long time. And so Sound Learning, APA, I think it's .org. If not, just do a Google search for Sound Learning, the APA. There are lessons already in place. And really, those are just models. We know that with classroom lessons and instruction, we're always going to take it and we're going to tweak it and make it our own, right? But it's a great place to start. So there are lessons there. There are videos there actually showing teachers, really teachers doing some creative things with audio instruction, direct instruction in the classroom. So I'd encourage you to go search those out if you're engaging with kids. If you don't quite know what to do, but you recognize, hopefully you all recognize, that there's a lot of power in doing so. You're benefiting your students in all kinds of ways that you may not have thought about before.
I can't agree more, and I know that as someone who, I'm going to apologize to my Random House friends, as someone who reads Charlotte's Web every year just about as the most perfect book. There's also something really wonderful about hearing E.B. White say those words, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" It's of course, the book is one way to experience it, but when you hear those words spoken by an author, it can be a powerful and compelling thing. So we read and we listen and we learn, and there's no one way. So that would be my sermon for the day.
That's a good one.